South Lebanon, a region that is one of the most volatile front lines of the Arab-Israeli conflict. A place where international borders are poorly defined and disputed. An area called the Shebaa Farms highlights the disagreement over borders and the danger of violence. The Shebaa Farms is a sliver of land between Lebanon and Syria. The area was captured by Israel in 1967, along with the Golan Heights from Syria. To this day, the Israelis remain there. Lebanon says it owns the Shebaa Farms. Syria agrees. But the United Nations has ruled that the area belongs to Syria. And Israel says it will only withdraw from the area via negotiations with Syria. Beside the Shebaa Farms is the small town of Kfar Shebaa in South Lebanon. We arranged a tour of the area with a local Lebanese MP as well as the town's mayor. Israeli military positions on the Shebaa Farms hilltops overlook the town of Kfar Shebaa. The Shebaa Farms became a hot political issue in the months preceding Israel's withdrawal from South Lebanon in May 2000. Lebanon demanded Israel pull out of the area, along with the rest of South Lebanon. Israeli troops remained on the hilltops. We drove to the last Lebanese military outpost bordering the Shebaa Farms hills. A contingent of Indian troops, part of the United Nations peacekeeping force in the region, mans an observation post here. In July 2009, Israeli troops erected a new sand barricade and an observation post in the no man's land between Lebanon and the Shebaa Farms. Angry residents of Kfar Shebaa responded by climbing the barricade and hoisting the Lebanese flag and the flag of the Lebanese Hezbollah party. Israeli tanks quickly arrived on the scene. UN peacekeepers and the Lebanese army went on high alert. Such incidents have the potential to spark hostilities. In this instance, cooler heads prevailed and calm was restored. The Indian peacekeepers from the UN force in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, patrol the no man's land. UNIFIL troops do not have the right to open the Lebanese border gate, so a member of the town's municipality obliges, allowing us to enter the no man's land and to the very edge of what is called the Blue Line. The Blue Line was demarcated by the United Nations in 2000 to verify Israel's withdrawal from South Lebanon of that year. Drawing the line, the UN placed the Shebaa Farms outside of Lebanon and within the Syrian Golan Heights, currently occupied by Israel. The UN troops deploy to ensure we don't cross the Blue Line, which, in parts, is no more than a painted rock or elsewhere a painted barrel. Local MP Qasim Hashim is scornful of the line drawn by the UN. He typifies the Lebanese official position that the Shebaa Farms belong to Lebanon.
We don't recognize red or blue lines. We declare that the enemy is positioned on Lebanese land, owned by the sons of this region. All of Kfar Shebaa town and the whole of Shebaa Farms is Lebanese territory. We demand the departure of the occupation forces because everything happening today is caused by the occupation.
In the presence of our camera, one local pushes across the UN's Blue Line to demonstrate his claim to the land. The Indian peacekeepers prove powerless to stop him. A Lebanese army officer is called to bring the villager back. The mayor of Kfar Shebaa explains the locals only accept the UN presence with conditions.
To maintain an atmosphere of friendship and respect, the UNIFIL forces must remain committed to a number of points. Firstly, they should remain calm and act wisely and cautiously, especially given that this land is ours and they know that. Secondly, they shouldn't think that they can exceed the authority of the Lebanese army and presume full power in the south.
Lebanon's international border was drawn up in 1923 by Colonels Paulet and Newcomb, French and British officers at the time of the French Mandate of Lebanon and the British Mandate of Palestine. Dr. Issam Khalifa, professor of history at the Lebanese University, is a specialist on the region's border disputes.
Greater Lebanon was announced by General Henri Gouraud. This is the map of Gouraud. The problem lies in the contradiction between Resolution 318, which sets Lebanon's borders at Hasbaya, including Shebaa Farms and Shebaa Town, and the map attached to Resolution 318, which places the farms outside of Lebanon. The problem started from here.
The inconsistencies of these colonial cartographers in defining the borders between Lebanon, Syria and Palestine created problems for the future. From 1939, joint Syrian-Lebanese committees were set up to arbitrate land disputes between residents of the Shebaa Farms area. The first document recognizing Lebanese sovereignty over the Shebaa Farms dates back to March 27, 1946.
This is the Syrian-Lebanese report, signed by both governments, in which Syria admits the Shebaa Farms is Lebanese land. 13 Lebanese farms. This report, attached to this map, is signed. The map shows the border points from point 7 to point 49. So there is a clear demarcation of the border between Lebanon and Syria regarding the farms. Lebanon did not submit this agreement to the United Nations. The borders were set and demarcated, but this was not submitted to the UN Maps Department.
Over the years, joint Syrian-Lebanese committees continued to arbitrate on land disputes among farmers in the area. But then the Six-Day War in 1967 changed everything. In its devastating victory, Israel seized, among other Arab land, the Golan Heights and the Shebaa Farms area. Jamil Said, Lebanon's former chief of general security, has, for years, closely tracked the Shebaa Farms case.
Since independence and up until 1967, shortly before the invasion, there was a demarcation of the Syrian-Lebanese border from the north to the east, up to the Shebaa region. A file was created for each disputed area. The Shebaa Farms file had the title Case 21. So 2 or 3 months before the 1967 war, we had agreed on the international border and territorial sovereignty. Both parties had agreed and signed.
In the late 60s and 70s, the Shebaa Farms region and surrounding areas became a front for the Palestine Liberation Organization. After the Arab-Israeli War in October 1973, the UN deployed peacekeeping troops to the Golan Heights. The occupied Shebaa Farms area came under the operational remit of this UN force, known as UNDOF. The UN clearly considered the Shebaa Farms as part of the Syrian Golan Heights. Nestled in a mountainside beside the occupied Shebaa Farms is the town of Shebaa. Today, the town of Shebaa is under Lebanese control. Israel withdrew from here in 2000. Town elders still hold documents, which they say prove their possession of the overlooking hilltops. Omar Hashim is one of these elders. He points to the land he says he owns, and he produces documents in support of his claim.
We own the farthest farm, called Khalad Ghazala. We have a Lebanese document of ownership dating back to 1943. I have it here with me, and many more documents. This is the document of possession of Khalad Ghazala, the furthest farm in Shebaa Farms on the Palestinian-Syrian border.
Lebanese sovereignty over the Shebaa Farms is also emphasized by Hezbollah. The group rejects calls for its disarmament, based on the premise that Israel still occupies Lebanese land.
The Lebanese people all agree that the Shebaa Farms belong to Lebanon. There was some controversy sparked by internal political unrest. However, this land is definitely and undoubtedly Lebanese territory. As for Syria, there are several statements made by Syrian officials declaring that the Shebaa Farms is Lebanese territory.
Across the border in Israel, the view is different. Amos Harel is a military affairs analyst with the Israeli Haaretz newspaper. He explains that Israel considers the Shebaa Farms region as Syrian territory.
When you talk to both Israeli politicians and Israeli experts in geography, they claim that Shebaa Farms was never a part of the Lebanese state, and it was actually held by Syria, that before '67, both the village of Rajar and the Shebaa Farms were under a Syrian regime. So Israel claims differently.
Medhat Salah is a Syrian government official in charge of the Golan Heights file. He rejects the Israeli claim that the Shebaa Farms belong to Syria.
The Syrian position is clear. The Shebaa Farms is Lebanese territory, and President Bashar al-Assad has confirmed that. The Lebanese are aware of this, and there is a Syrian-Lebanese agreement on this.
These hills are part of the Israeli-occupied Shebaa Farms, as filmed from the Lebanese side of the Blue Line. An old sign showing the symbol of Lebanon, the cedar tree, suggests Lebanon's historic claim to this region. The Indian UN troops get nervous at our presence on the Blue Line border.
Yes, Al Jazeera channel. You wait here, sir. My officer is come here, and your photography, please. Okay, but we have permission. We have permission. Please, only for 5 minutes.
They are not the only ones wary. An Israeli patrol passes by. The area we are in is particularly sensitive. At this precise spot in the year 2000, 3 Israeli soldiers were captured by Hezbollah in a daring sting operation. As elsewhere, the blue line here is ambiguous, an explosive front line marked only by intermittent painted barrels. In 2000, when Israel informed the UN of its plan to withdraw from South Lebanon, then UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan sent his special envoy, Norwegian diplomat Terry Rod Larsen, to the region. His mission was to negotiate a line of withdrawal. The Blue Line is not supposed to be the final decision on the international border.
The Blue Line is not the border. The Blue Line is, the official name is actually Line of Withdrawal. This was the line which was identified in 2000 by the United Nations for the sole purpose of verifying Israeli withdrawal from the Lebanese territory. So it was done without any prejudice to a future border demarcation agreement between Lebanon and Israel or between Lebanon and Syria.
Israel surprised the UN by withdrawing from South Lebanon sooner than expected. Larsen rushed back to the region. He personally supervised the demarcation of the Blue Line in consultation with all sides. At times, the process involved haggling over inches. Neither side wanted to compromise. There were a number of places which proved especially difficult to secure agreement from both Lebanon and Israel, including the Shebaa Farms region.
Both Lebanon and Israel had reservations about this line, and they voiced their reservations in 2000. However, the point at that time was to disengage the forces, to have the Israeli army withdraw back to Israel.
Israel refused to withdraw from the Shebaa Farms region. Lebanon declared Israel's withdrawal in 2000 to be incomplete. To this day, Lebanese officials argue that Israel's occupation of the Shebaa Farms means resistance is justified.
I told Larson the blue line is from Naqoura to Hasbani, and we, as the Lebanese state, are committed to respecting it, whichever official, legal or illegal forces are deployed there. But if Israel commits violations across the blue line, with planes flying over the area and violating our airspace, then we reserve the right to respond. This right exists, and Larson can tell you that. The Shebaa Farms is an occupied region. We do not consider it as part of the blue line, and so our right to take it back is legitimate, a right which is acknowledged by the UN.
Terry Rod Larson returned to the region in the following years. He continued to affirm the UN position that the Shebaa Farms is Syrian, not Lebanese territory. This argument does not go down well in Beirut or Damascus.
When two countries agree and sign upon the demarcation of their borders, the UN should then endorse this agreement. Larson's rejection came to protect Israel and to allow its military forces to remain in their positions in the Shebaa Farms. It was a big mistake, and it damaged UN credibility.
Once again, war was to overshadow the deadlock. In 2006, Israel launched a full-scale war against Lebanon after Hezbollah captured 2 of its soldiers. The 33-day war devastated Lebanon. But UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which ended the war, put the disputed case of the Shebaa Farms back in the limelight.
The Shebaa Farms is an important issue which is specifically included in Resolution 1701. The Secretary General was asked to study this issue and to come up with some proposal. There was a proposal from the Lebanese government, so-called 7-point proposal, which included some ideas concerning Shebaa Farms.
The Lebanese government proposed a temporary solution to the dispute over the Blue Line and the Shebaa Farms, that Israel withdraw and UNIFIL forces deploy in the region. To this day, Israel continues to occupy the Shebaa Farms. The Shebaa Farms is a major focal point of dispute, but it is not the only one. Just a few kilometers away, the village of Al-Ghajja also highlights the Gordian knot of disputed borderlines, security fears, and questions of identity. Along with the Shebaa Farms, the village of Al-Ghajja ranks as one of the thorniest cases of dispute between Lebanon and Syria on the one side and Israel on the other. Al-Ghajja is just outside the Shebaa Farms region, situated on the border between Lebanon and the northern tip of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. The village seems to have existed in ambiguity for many years. Prior to the Six-Day War in 1967, the village came under Syrian control. Israel did not capture the village when it seized the Golan Heights in 1967, believing it to be Lebanese territory. However, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978, and in 1981 the village was included in Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. When Israel withdrew from South Lebanon in 2000, the United Nations drew the blue line straight through the center of the village. The northern part of Al-Ghajja was given to Lebanon. The southern part remained under Israeli occupation.
We agreed to divide Al-Ghajja village into 2 parts. Israel remains in the occupied part of the town, we don't enter the Lebanese part, but it remains under UN responsibility. Israel exploited this situation during the July 2006 war and again practiced the same old violations by raising the demarcation issue. The borders do not need to be marked. Our borders are clear.
In the 2006 war, Israel reoccupied the northern part of Al-Ghazha. Israel now controls both parts of the village, contravening UN Resolution 1701, which ended the war in 2006.
In connection with Gaza, Resolution 1701 is very clear. Israel must withdraw south of the blue line, which is in the middle of the village. Our talks are about security and humanitarian arrangements to be put in place following the Israeli withdrawal. But Israeli withdrawal is not negotiable. They have to withdraw.
The village of Al-Ghazha lies beside the Al-Wazani River, a factor that highlights how border disputes are complicated by the importance of water issues in this region. The residents of the village are mostly Alawai, a branch of Shia Islam. They stress their Syrian identity and their desire to return to Syrian sovereignty. But Israeli journalist Amos Harel doubts this is a genuine demand.
I think that if you talk to the residents there and not hold a camera and a microphone at them, you hear differently. Some of them would like the connection with Israel. They get better facilities, they get better medical care and so on. I suspect from my visits, it was a long time ago, but from my visits to the village, that not everybody there is too crazy about becoming Lebanese or Syrian again.
Every time an Israeli official visits Al-Ghazar village, its residents affirm they are Syrian Arabs and stress that they wish to return to their homeland, Syria.
On August 5, 2009, Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman took a controversial trip to Al-Ghazha, visiting both parts of the village.
The Israeli Foreign Minister's visit to the village was a violation of Lebanese sovereignty. The United Nations should not have stood by idle in the face of his sneaking into Lebanese territory. It's unacceptable.
The dispute over the Shebaa Farms and the unusual case of Al-Ghazha village means tensions remain high in the region. For its part, Israel feels it has conceded enough.
The way the Israelis see it, we obeyed in all parts except two. The question of Rajah, which wasn't decided and is still debated, and the question of Shebaa Farms, where there Israel claims that it's actually Syrian territory and not Lebanese, and this should be discussed in the future according to a peace agreement between Israel and Syria.
Lebanon and Syria disagree with this interpretation. The result is a dangerous deadlock in which diplomacy is frozen and war often becomes a continuation of politics by other means. Hezbollah justifies its armed presence and resistance by citing Israeli occupation of Lebanese land. And Israeli forces regularly violate Lebanese sovereignty of its air, land, and sea. The mission of the UN peacekeepers along the Blue Line is an unenviable task. The border disputes keep tensions high.
The question of the Shebaa Farms remain, and as we know, until now, it's been used as an issue. It hasn't been solved, and I suspect that it will take time before somebody reaches an agreement or a solution there.
Israel never concedes unless it is pressured, and unless it is paying a larger price than it already pays. No one can make it pay that price except the resistance.
With diplomacy seemingly stuck, tensions remain high across one of the most volatile front lines of the Arab-Israeli conflict.